Welcome to World Builders Anvil, episode 317. Starting your story. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world?
Do you need more? Does it make sense?
Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination.
This is the place where we will prime your mind.
Now, it's time to heat up the forge.
Break out the mithril ingots and hammer.
Welcome to the World Builders Anvil. I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm Michael Miller.
Let's sup from the muck of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, speaking very slowly, my name is Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And listening even slower, I am Michael Miller. Slow down your listening. Slow down. I want you to slow your listening.
You're speaking too fast. Well, listen more slowly.
Listen more slowly. Okay. So now you guys may remember a little while back, we had talked about, I think it was in 307 or was it 301? Which was the one from the Pixar?
Okay, so 301 was Pixar?
Okay. Yep. And please reference the person's name because I forget it and they deserve.
I believe it was Emma Coates.
Yes. So Emma Coates had written, I believe it was an article or she posted stuff on Instagram or
tweets.
They were tweets. So she put up a bunch of tweets about her insights from working on Pixar about starting stories and things you should remember. And Jeff and I aped that for an episode. And now we're going to expand upon one of the things that we talked about in that episode to help you guys start a story.
Yeah. And episode 307 came up, and that's where we talked about our story basics. You know, and essentially it was kind of a quick system that I threw together to try and have all of the basics. And kind of looking back at episode 301, I realized that there was literally a sentence in there. It was called "Once upon a time there was blank. Every day, comma blank. One day, blank. Because of that, comma blank. Because of that, comma blank. Until finally, blank."
There's periods in there too.
There's periods in there too, but I only did the commas because I like a run-on sentence.
I know you're a big fan.
I like a good run-on sentence.
Shocker from someone who talks as much as you.
My voice is like a run-on sentence, is what you're saying.
Yes.
And so the idea was, why don't we sort of hook those two things together, you know? And so, because I was kind of looking at it, and I was like, well, if you look at the structure that Emma gave us, where is my show notes here? Okay. I'm so very prepared. Okay. Essentially, if you think about the story structure we came up to, which was, you know, you create your before the story, then you have the incident, then you have the strike, you know, the fail, and then you have the fallout from the fail, and then you have the run, which is where you win, and then you wrap it up with your after story. And then I was looking at like her sentence, and I'm like, once upon a time there was, this could be a character, an item, something in the story. Every day, before the story, one day the incident happens. Mm-hmm. Because of that, there's the strike. Because of that, there's the fallout. Because of that, finally you get the run. Mm-hmm. And so it's really, it kind of mirrors up with how I like to think of stories too. Mm-hmm. And so Michael and I were talking, and we're like, we really need to take this and go back to something that people recognize and we can talk way too long about, because that's our specialty, and get something out there to help people see that the overall story, the idea of it really should be able to be boiled down into one sentence. You know, if you've ever gone to like a business class and they tell you, oh, you want to be a business owner, you need your elevator speech. This one sentence, this thing of it is like your elevator tweet for your
that's pretty fair,
for your story. And it's not going to cover every element of the story. It's going to cover the big things. So once upon a time, what is the protagonist, or what's the story going to be about? And what is life like before? Why does it change? Why is there a story? And then because of that, you have the major plot points.
May I give an example? So Jeff and I were talking about this before the show, and I was arguing with him for a few minutes. I know it's a shocker for
Shocking,
long-term listeners.
We could just recorded that, and that could have been the episode.
It really could have. Part of it totally could, and we'll probably get back into it. And I argued about this structure briefly because I was like, all right, well, let's use a familiar example for the listeners, something that most of them are probably aware of, and put it within the structure to see if it works in reverse as a way to create a familiarity and understanding.
As Michael and I, most people know, reverse engineering is the best way.
We do it. Yeah, we try to do that a lot. So once upon a time, there was a hobbit named Bilbo. Every day he gardened and ate and drank and slept. Until one day, there was a knock at his door from a bunch of dwarves and a wizard. And because of that, he went on a grand adventure. Because of that, he ended up at a battle of 5 armies until finally all the resolution occurred and everybody was happy and he returned to the Shire. So my argument was that you could put about 15 because of that. And there's only 2 in this basic structure. Between one day, because of that, and until finally, that's where the majority of the story is probably going to take place. So we're really abbreviating a great deal, and that is something that I focused on. Maybe your tale will be a little different. Maybe you'll spend more time in the introduction, but just understand how basic this is, and don't let that feel limiting. Look at that as a possibility for you to expound greatly.
And one of the things we talked about in episode 307 when we talked about story basics are you're going to have subplots. You're going to have other things that like add words to your story, but it's also context and meaning for the people who are interacting with the story. It's stuff that they need for the story is what you should be adding the words for. The idea is really when you're doing this, it's the everyday that is your epilogue for your story. And then, one day is what is act 1, what's act 2, and, the climax, and then what's the third act? What are the 3 acts of the story? It's really between one day because of that and because of that. And then your resolution to your story comes until finally what's the ultimate resolution. So I looked at this a little bit differently than Michael. My thing is, once upon a time there was a hobbit named Bilbo. Every day he was really boring. And that's all the stuff that Michael said, gardening and doing all this stuff, just this boring.
But see, you say it that way, but I think it's important to I think that's important in establishing information for the character, and the reader needs to know what kind of guy. It's not like Bilbo was this adventuring badass and then he went on an adventure.
He could have been, right?
He could have
changed the story. The thing is, you're taking the elements that were used to flesh out the story, and you're trying to define it in what in this short paragraph, defining the story. And my point being, you don't need that at this point. You might know that, and you maybe, like Michael, have a little bit more information in there. But the idea is, he's a boring country bumpkin, and that is essentially what Bilbo was. And he was built up that way really well in the book. I thought that was actually one of the better parts of the Hobbit, was the build of Bilbo being this really boring guy, but being pulled towards this life of what they call being a burglar, which kind of is what we think of a burglar, but not really.
Go burgle.
The modern RPG sense of burglar, definitely. And then, one day a wizard marks his door, and Bilbo leaves on an adventure with dwarfs and kind of the wizard, but let's be honest.
Yeah, it's mostly
Gandalf never hangs out much for when, it would be way too easy of a story if he was there all of the time. So
Gandalf is there for Tolkien.
That's right. And so the idea is, and that is really what the incident is, the one day is he leaves out on this adventure. That's it, right? And yeah, there was a lot of stuff. If you read the book, there's a lot of details. That is really the first act is built up to when he leaves the Shire. You could maybe argue that the combination with the trolls are, but the thing is, as a storyteller, you get to determine what these major breaks are in your story, because it's not going to be every detail to get there. Like for me, in this my next because of that is because of that they return to the under the mountain. I don't really give any details of what happens there. Obviously, the story, a good part of the story happens there. They fight trolls. They get kidnapped by elves and goblins and
spiders. Tom Bombadil.
Spiders and Tom Bombadil is the other book.
No, he shows up.
He's in this one too. I forget.
Very, very briefly.
Okay, he does a cameo.
Yeah.
But you have these quick elements happening within there. But really, they're getting to Undermountain. And it's leading up to the big battle with Smaug, where he ends up being defeated by the people in the town. But it's one event. They fight him. He gets bad, goes down to the town, and ends up getting killed because of a message Bilbo delivers to the archer. And then the second because of that is you have 4 armies descend upon the mountain, and you have the battle of the 5 armies because everyone wants concessions because of what's happened. They want riches from days gone past that are owed to them, or they want or they want to get compensated for the destruction to their town. And big battle ensues, and until finally the Eagles show up and save the day, which is, I think, the major way Tolkien deals with all of his issues. Are Eagles show up and solve problems. The claw of Tolkien, I guess you would say. The Token Claw.
Token Claw.
And
wait, Token or Tolkien?
Yes. And it's good we can still drive humor from that simple statement, but until the day that happens, and then the king under the mountain is forced to do some concessions and to actually not really hold on to all of the riches, but to reward and compensate as appropriate the people who deserve it, and the bad guys lose. And then really you're just kind of waiting at that point because this ring thing showed up in there, which we talked about before we actually argued about, because I actually said that was one of the because of that. So Michael's right in shooting me down, because in the scope of this book, it's an unimportant event. It's a neat way for him to escape a moment.
Yeah, you could remove the one ring from the story of the Hobbit and it would not matter at all. You could simply say that he, fled off in the dark and the Gollum just lost him in the dark. I mean, you could also argue that Gollum,
which is kind of what happened, but it was the ring caused dark, essentially.
Right. So you could say that you could write any little thing in there to have him escape Gollum and have that be that, because beyond the interactions that Gollum has with Bilbo in there, Gollum doesn't affect the rest of the story. This is an offshoot off of the actual plot line. So remove the one ring from the Hobbit, doesn't matter at all.
And really too, when you're coming up with your sentence, it could start off even more generic than that, right? So it could be, once upon a time there was a boring country bumpkin. That could have been that line, and you could take all those elements and give it to 20 writers and come up with 20 different stories that have all of the same major beats. And that's kind of the interesting thing with this is, you could take, you can condense a story down to the sentence, and you're really looking at where's the transition between the acts. Those are the important things that happen. What's the focus of the story, which is usually going to be the protagonist, is going to be at the beginning, and then the BS is sort of the lead up to how the story starts, and which doesn't always necessarily have to be around the protagonist. Maybe it's around the sidekick, and then also the protagonist shows up and saves the day, and the story starts down its path. You could do that as well too. What's John Carter, Man of Mars? I don't know if anyone's ever
Prince of Mars.
No, it's a different book.
Oh, it's not. Okay.
There was a crap ton of John Carter books.
I did not know that.
And the original one was John Carter, Man of Mars, I believe.
Okay.
And it's sort of it's the guy who wrote Tarzan. I don't remember his name right now. I feel kind of bad, but it's a serial. And really, this guy, he was sort of the he was the Stephen King of his day, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and John Carter was actually his most popular material as well. But the thing was, the initial story, he's not on Earth. And so it's about this guy trying to find him. And so the first act is all finding John Carter. So you learn little bits about who John Carter is, and then you find him on Mars, and you start to learn about what happened to him on Mars. And then you have the actual story of what takes place on Mars. And all those elements don't really matter too much here. But the point is, the first story was essentially a side character whose job it was to introduce you to the protagonist. So it's not going to always be your protagonist in the beginning. So keep that in mind too. But in this way we set it up is once upon a time we were kind of setting it up to be the protagonist if you know the Hobbit story. But you could, that's the great thing, it's adding the details in is the pleasure part. And then if you go back to the story at the basics episode, when I talk about the stuff, you can reuse that line to go, okay, I want a subplot to talk about this other character, to talk about this important side character, the King Under the Mountain. I want to work in his backstory in here as well too. I might follow the same incidents and go back at some point to talk about his past, why he's coming forward, and to try and bring his story in there and weave it in with the main narrative of the story. And you can and it's kind of like what Michael was saying. His problem is like, he feels like there could be a lot of because of that's, it's like, and really, if you read The Hobbit, the whole thing is kind of like, and then this happened, which forces them into this problem, which forces them into this problem, until all of a sudden they win. And and then they looks like they're going to lose it all, and then they kind of win, and so, but really, the major strokes of the story are there. The other stuff are just subplots that were added in. Well, I want to do this thing with trolls, and I want to introduce trolls, and so I want to have this little scene with trolls. So you get into the story there. You want to introduce the elves, so later on when their army shows up, it makes sense. So you want scenes to introduce all those things that are going to be armies later on. And then okay, the big bad guys, the goblins, are coming. So now all of the good guy races are going to combine together to fight them, even though 20 minutes before they were all fighting each other, which, you kind of look at in the story of that, it's sort of like the lead up to World War One. And then the actual World War One is the Battle of the Five Armies. And then, you're set into this time period waiting for World War II to happen after The Hobbit. And I do believe it was written after the fact too. I believe that the Fellowship was the thing written, and then he went back and wrote this afterwards, but I'm not positive. I'm sure there's a token fan out there who can explain it to us. But yeah, the thing is, you can actually, much like you can reuse the elements and stories at a basic, this sentence you can kind of reuse, and maybe every time you don't need to go into what life was like before, but it's like you need it to tie the element into the story. So whether it's an artifact like a ring, or if it's a character like Gandalf, and you want to do a side quest with them, you need to tie them in to give them a reason of why they're interacting with the story, maybe even get into their motivations of what they're trying to get out of the story, what they're trying to achieve in this, whether they're good guy or bad, and then, get to their resolution, which might or might not be the same climax as the actual story, because you're not always going to have all of the, I think it would be kind of awkward if all of the stories sort of tied together, but there are some things that are probably like that. Michael could probably think of a few where there are a whole bunch of like these desperate like plots and characters that seem completely disconnected, and then all of a sudden when the climax happens, it all comes together. You're like, oh, that's why they were all doing what they were doing.
Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, that's a good one.
But they are just separate. They're just tied together with loose threads. They don't tie together.
It's not a true
toward a conflict resolution.
Yeah.
Just so happens,
but they're definitely. I think this is more of a common thing in the indie type of thing, where you do that, where you have these things that seem completely unrelated. What's the guy who was trying to do the super channel?
M. Night Shyamalan.
Yeah. And he was doing the thing with Bruce Willis, and then you kind of learn that Bruce Willis is a superhero, and then you're in another thing 20 years later, and all of a sudden they bring back Bruce Willis, and it tries to connect it together to say that this is a superhero story too.
Well, they did. I mean, did you watch the third movie?
I've not seen the third movie, but yeah.
It's good.
I'm sure it is, but it was kind of that. But that was like bigger than an actual movie. That was like the trilogy plot. Or what ended up being written after it made money, I guess.
I maybe. I don't know if that quite is a good illustration of the point you're trying to make. But what is just from a character standpoint, if only watching the second two movies, which is the third one is called Glass. The second one is called oh my gosh, I cannot remember the second one. And the second one, if you ask me, is the best one, which is which introduces James McAvoy's, I'm going to go with air quotes, character, but the character has a whole bunch of personalities. So James McAvoy plays unbelievably a whole bunch of characters, and he changes, frequently in the same scene, and very convincingly. It's really an amazing performance.
Dude, that's one I've never seen.
It's an amazing performance.
I only saw what was the first one, like Break?
The first one was called Unbreakable.
Unbreakable.
The second one was called Split, and the third one was called Glass. And the conclusion to James McAvoy's character in the third movie is fantastic. I won't spoil it for anybody.
We don't need to at this point. Yeah.
We mean spoil it, or
we don't need to spoil it at this point. Yeah.
Well,
does it further our episode?
No, it doesn't. So do you want to do one of these Once Upon a Time fill in the blank jobbies, just to give everybody a taste of what could be a skeleton?
Let's do that. So I'm going to go down here.
This is almost like a Mad Lib.
Yeah. Think about it. It's like you could sit there and go, once upon a time there was a noun.
Yes, you absolutely could do that. All right. So do you want to do it? You're going to do one.
We'll do every other one.
Is that how we're going to do it? I was going to say, I will read it. You create it within the context of your world.
Well, I don't want it in context of my world. I just want a generic story with no setting.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. All right. Once upon a time.
You'll see why when we get to the world builder's task.
Okay.
If it's somehow related to this.
They usually are. I've seen a pattern. Once upon a time, there was a Jeffrey.
Well, I'm trying to think of something interesting, but my clever meter is on 0.
A crystalline-based life form shaped like a spider.
How about we'll say a spider?
You want the main character to be a spider? I was joking because
it doesn't. Remember, it doesn't need to be the main character, right?
True, but the reason I was doing that was to be really facetious, because crystalline-based life forms are hard to empathize and understand.
I cut out the crystalline base. I just said spider.
I know you did, but spiders are also very hard to
empathize with. Yeah.
Yes, because they're completely different.
And I'll say every day.
So you're sticking with the spider.
Yes. It hunted.
Okay. Every day it hunted.
And fed on villagers.
Okay.
This is a children's story, I think.
Okay. Until one day.
Probably by Disney. I don't know if it's bloody enough to be Disney or Pixar, but it's a children's story.
Until one day, Greta.
A hunter.
No, it's mine.
Okay.
Greta, a young village girl. Survived an attack from the spider.
Oh. Well, you threw me for a loop there.
I'm trying to. And because of that, you can fill in this one.
I'm trying to keep the Disney Pixar theme here in line.
Now, some of them get pretty dark, so there's a lot of
that's why I'm thinking pretty cruelly here.
Yeah. Well, I say go grim fairy tale because
of that, she sacrifices
her little brother. No.
her sister or
you're awful.
her mom. Not dad. I'll make it dad. That way Kristen doesn't get offended.
Now, does she sacrifice her because of the attack or during the attack to survive? She pushes her mother in the way, like, I don't need to run faster than you, just faster than the bear, sort of thing. You know what I mean?
I think it's maybe in an after event, right? Like she knows the spider's going to come for her, so she sets her mom up to take the fall, basically.
Oh, I see.
Like her dad. I'm changing that.
Her dad. Dad, the laundry's hanging outside. I know I said I would get it, but would you please get it while I prepare dinner? Sure, honey. And then the spider comes, sort of thing. No. Okay,
so you get the next because of that. In our Disney Pixar extravaganza here.
Can I go a little long? Because of that, the village, because she was familyless, and obviously cursed by the spider, she was kicked out of the village. So she chose to go on an adventure to get the spider back.
Kicked out of the village,
even though she was
and
they took her. I say she Machiavellianly, planned the father's death.
Adventure.
And that's the big reason they kicked her out. They knew she was no good.
With a dumb male warrior, a dumb male prince. Let's say a dumb prince. Until finally, and going Disney Pixar here, they defeat the spider, and everyone loves them for some strange reason. Yeah, because that's kind of how it works out, right? It's like they saved the day and it was like, yay, we like you, even though you've done some horrible things throughout the story.
Yeah, we love you, except for the other spiders. The other spiders are not fans.
Well, that's when you remake the sequel, right? So this one makes money of the sequel on this,
and that's from the spider. That's from the spider's perspective, and you find out that spider was just trying to feed its 8 billion children, little baby spiders,
little children, and it was.
Have you ever seen a spider spawn?
Yes, I've seen an actual egg hatch.
Me too.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's not, what I saw was not a egg hatching. What I saw was about 500.
Well, they're inside of a whole bunch of them that are inside of the it's usually a webbing that surround an egg sac.
The one that I saw, they were like all in a web. Like, yes, they were not totally ball. So there was just tons of them. And it wasn't like a big scary spider dangerous thing. These things were like barely
minuscule.
We're talking.
There's so many because most are going to die.
Yeah, the head of a toothpick sort of size. You know what I mean? But it was really amazing to watch.
But it would make for a horrifying story if you make them larger. People don't like large spiders. Sort of something wicked this way comes spider scene.
I'm sorry. Do you remember that? Like those were all tarantulas.
Yes. I remember that.
They were big spiders.
Yes, as I said, it could become horrifying if it's like that, So if you have like an egg sac with like hundreds of tarantula-sized things coming out, it becomes disgusting and icky to people.
Mm-hmm.
But seeing it in real life, it's kind of cool, but not very frightening.
Oh, aren't they cute? Until they grow.
Unless you're like, I guess, spider phobic, that might flip you out, I guess. Yeah. So the real world, or the world building task. And this one's coming from me here today, folks. Take the story thread and come up with a short story and share it in the Undercraft. That is facebook.com/groups/Undercraft. Just come in and give some more details to the story, right? Take that plot and add some details to it to make it your own. You can keep it Disney or go any way you want to with it.
My vote is Grimm.
Disney, same thing.
And for the real world task, go out there and get some fresh air. The nicer weather has finally started to poke its head out. We're starting to see some better temperatures. Wear a mask. Coronavirus is everywhere, and it's going to kill everyone. So
yeah, actually, don't wear masks. They're not useful. It's like wearing a mask versus a cold. It just doesn't work.
Well, wash your hands.
Let the
at
masks
least.
go to the people in hospitals.
I watched.
Wash your hands.
Yeah, wash your hands. I watched a post the other day. It was like a 15-second horror movie. 15 seconds, and all it is I don't know if it was meant to be China or Japan or whatever, but it was a whole bunch of Asian men and women on a street corner waiting for the light to turn so they could cross the street. They're all wearing masks, and one guy at the front is coughing and coughing and coughing, and he pulls his mask back and he spits into the puddle that's right in front of him. Then he puts his mask back. No one does anything, but then a bus comes along and splashes everybody with that puddle. And then that's it. That's the end of it.
Story.
That's the story.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah,
because I think they wear more the masks in like China is to keep the smog from getting in. Inhaling
I'm sure it's a germ thing too, because you figure, such close quarters, so many people,
It could be. I think there's really bad smog in China.
Yeah.
And right, like worse than the U.S. in the 70s, I think. So yeah.
All right, kids. Well, that's all we wrote today.
Yes. I hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the World Builders Anvil.
We would love it if you would share the World Builders Anvil with 2 of your friends.
And so would they.
If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting.
Take them to Stitcher or iTunes, or best of all, just send them to our website, www.gardul.com.
That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.